Hey, what's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into another intense Reddit confession thread. These are real stories shared by people online, and honestly, some of them are shocking, emotional, and sometimes downright disturbing. In the first story, this guy spent 25 years believing his mother was the perfect parent, loving, supportive, successful, and someone he truly admired growing up. But over the last few years, everything he believed about her slowly started to fall apart. Strange behavior, secrets, and lies began surfacing, and the truth behind it all would eventually tear his entire family apart. And the moment he finally discovered what was really going on, it completely changed the way he saw his own mother forever. So yeah, this one gets pretty crazy. If you enjoy listening to real Reddit stories and confessions like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel grow. And if you have your own story or confession you'd like to share, feel free to send it in. You never know, it might be featured in a future video. Alright, let's get into the first story. I caught my mom, who I thought was an angel, having an affair on my dad. Now I can't stand her and see her for the sociopath she is. My ex-wife and I divorced about 6 years ago, and it was not a peaceful separation. The divorce was messy, emotional, and honestly pretty ugly. By the time everything was finalized, both of us were completely drained from years of arguments and resentment that had built up between us. We have two sons together who are now 9 and 13 years old, and despite everything that happened between us, we both agreed on one important thing: the kids had to come first. We ended up creating a custody arrangement that actually worked well for both of us. We live about 2 miles apart and share the kids 1 week on and one. My parents are in their late 50s. My dad is very successful owner of his own business and is an all-around good guy, great father to my sisters and I, and is a way better husband than my mom deserves. They've been together since they were in high school. When in their sophomore year, my mom literally pulled a girl out of his Jeep and got in because she wanted to be with him. Red flag. He is more passive and my mom is aggressive, obviously. Any honeydew list he got, he did it. Anything my mother wanted, she got. His brother and even I always gave him shit for being so whipped. They went into over $90,000 in debt when I was 13 because my mom wanted a big house, Mercedes, and other crap they couldn't afford at the time. We went on expensive vacations that she planned, we ate at nice restaurants we couldn't afford, and the only thing my dad ever stood his ground on was that he gets to deer hunt with the guys 3 weekends a year, which my mom still bitched about being left out of. She has always had to be the center of whatever he does in life, no exceptions. But that isn't what made me see her for who she was. 4 years ago, my now wife and I were soon to be married. My mom suggested we all take a motorcycle trip one weekend. My dad and I ride together often with her old coworker. We'll call him James. She explained he was going through a tough time with his ex-wife and needed to get away. We go and have a good time for a weekend, but it just felt weird. It was my mom, dad, my now wife, and James. The dynamic and overall vibe of being around my mom's old friend was strange. He was a nice enough guy. He was tall, handsome, rich, and brawny. He had an ex-wife and 2 kids around my age, and he loved taking pictures of my mom and dad, which creeped me out. As the morning turned into the afternoon, the silence from her side started to bother me more and more. Normally, she would respond almost immediately if I sent a message about the kids. Even if she was busy, she would at least reply within a few minutes to say she would get back to me later. But this time there was nothing. No message, no call, nothing at all. After a few hours, I decided to call her phone. It rang for a while and then went to voicemail. I left a message telling her that I needed to grab our son's school book and asked her to call me back when she had a chance. There was still nothing. At that point, I started thinking about how strange her message from the night before had been. The way she had thanked me for being a good father and told me to tell the boys she loved them suddenly felt different in my mind. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things, but the silence kept making the feeling worse. Eventually, I called her again and it went straight to voicemail. That was when I decided to leave another message. I told her that if she then drops a bomb and tells me she and dad suspect she is having an affair with him. She goes on to explain how sketchy she has been acting, doing things like changing her phone and iPad password, stepping out for phone calls and whispering, even putting a fucking jar of rocks on her phone while she slept so she would be woken up if anyone touched it. I'm assuming I'd fucking weird. My dad managed to look in her phone before she changed her password and quickly skimmed through her texts with James and saw some suspicious cryptic dialogue. My mom finally gets back to us at the concert, and at this point I am pissed and devastated all at once. I ask her what took so long. She didn't even have the beer she left to get, and she says, "Oh, I ran into some old friends from my old job at." Immediately sensing bullshit, what are the chances her 50-plus-year-old friends also went to see Incubus? So I ask who. She didn't expect this follow-up question but slyly responds with, "You don't know them." I then ask, "Well, what are their names?" She's feeling the pressure and stutters before managing to make up some bullshit names. My wife and sister are listening to my interrogation very intently while Brandon Boyd is killing it in the background singing "Pardon Me." I get sick of her BS and drop it. I am livid and crushed in thinking of my dad. My sister had already gotten to the point of disgust I was at, so she didn't say anything and we all kind of ignored it until the next day. After this concert incident, my sister tells my father what happened, and he finally approaches my mother about everything. He demanded to see her call history and sees a 45-minute call to James at the time of the concert, along with many others. He demands to know what the hell is going on, and she says he is just going through a hard time with his ex-wife, who is apparently debilitated from alcoholism, and she was just helping him get through it as a friend. Anyway, to keep any readers interested, I am going to skip past the details that could make this the longest read ever. Basically, the suspicious behavior goes on for months, and at the time of my wedding, my father has a tracker in her car, has requested call logs from the phone company, and is looking at hiring a private investigator. I still remember dancing with her at my wedding. She looked at me adoringly, and I could not look back at her. Little did my father or I know, my love for kayaking would soon give him everything he needed. Then I reached the bedroom. The door was slightly open, and when I pushed it the rest of the way, I immediately saw something that made my heart stop for a second. She was lying on the bed, completely still. At first, my brain tried to convince me that she was just asleep, but then I noticed the dark red stain spreading across the front of her shirt. For a moment, I just stood there frozen, trying to understand what I was seeing. In her hand, there was something that looked like a phone. My mind kept trying to make sense of the scene, but something about it did not feel right. Then it finally registered in my head that it was not a phone at all. It was a gun. Let me know. I knew what he meant. I did not give my mother a heads up that I was coming on purpose, and as I drive up, I am relieved to see just her car and another girly-looking car in the driveway. I call my father before going in and tell him my initial assessment is that nothing suspicious is going on from what I see. It just looks like her and her friends are here. He is as relieved as I am. That was when everything suddenly became very real. The blood on her shirt, the silence in the room, the way she was lying there without moving. My heart started racing and my hands began shaking as I backed out of the room. I pulled out my phone and called 911, trying to explain what I had just found while my mind was still struggling to process it. The next few minutes felt like a blur. I remember pacing around the living room while waiting for the police and emergency responders to arrive. I kept looking toward the hallway, almost hoping that somehow I had misunderstood what I saw. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Side and see cell phones stacked where they are charging in the kitchen. I grab a phone I do not recognize. It does not have a lock on it, so I immediately go to the pictures. The first one is of two people I do not recognize, as well as my mother and James, and they are kissing each other on the lips. I scroll a little and there are more pictures of the same thing. My heart is jumping out of my chest at this point, and I take a few quick pictures of the photos in the phone and run out of the house, not even remembering or caring what I had originally been there for. When the police arrived, they quickly secured the house and began asking me questions. I told them everything I knew, which honestly was not much. I explained that I had not heard from her all day and came to check on her because it was unusual for her not to respond when it involved the kids. They asked about our relationship, our divorce, and the custody arrangement. Since I had been the one to find her, they needed to make sure they understood exactly what had happened. For the next 3 hours, I sat there answering questions while they documented everything inside the house. At some point, one of the officers told me that they would be contacting her parents to inform them. Because of the divorce, I was no longer considered next of kin. When they finally finished speaking with me, the reality of the situation started to sink in. I still had to go pick up my kids later that day. And somehow, I was going to have to act like everything was normal, even though I had just discovered something that was going to change their lives forever. To call my father and tell him immediately because he deserves to know, despite how bad it will hurt him. I then called my wife and she agreed, but we were both worried about what he would do. I hesitated for a bit but eventually called my father to tell him his wife of 25 years is cheating on him. When he answers, I just blurted out, "James is here. I have proof and mother is cheating on you." I did not know how to put it delicately, so I just gave him the facts. He was in shock like me. He kept saying the same phrase over and over. "No way, good grief, insert my mother's name, good grief, wow, son of a bitch, good grief." After the initial shock wears off, he apologizes that I had to be the one to see it and then says he is on his way. It is a 3-hour drive and he will meet up with me at my roommate's place. I immediately call my uncle, my father's identical twin and my other best friend, and tell him what is going on. I tell him I am afraid my father is going to do something stupid. He says he will make sure he does not. They end up coming down together and meet me at my roommate's house. We talk for a couple of hours and come up with a plan. They switch trucks with my roommate to go unnoticed because my father must see it for himself. My father promises he will not do anything stupid despite what he may see. He sneaks up there after dark, parks far away, and walks a mile through the woods with his brother and a pair of binoculars. He hides behind some trees when he gets in place and sees them on the patio drinking wine. They are cuddling and kissing like they are an old married couple, and what they are doing is not beyond messed up. It took every ounce of self-control for my father not to run over there and lose his mind on them. Instead, he did the smart thing, thankfully, and just took pictures of them and left. The next morning, he cleared out their bank account, sent her the pictures he took along with a text that said, "I know everything, I am leaving you." I can only imagine what their reaction was like. I rest assured that the rest of their little getaway was quite stressful. The next day, the situation got even harder. My oldest kept trying to text and call her, and every time there was no response, he became more upset. He told me that something was wrong and demanded that I take him to her house so he could check on her himself. He even started saying that if I did not take him, he would just go there after school on his own. Meanwhile, my 9-year-old began picking up on the tension as well. He could tell something was wrong even though he did not fully understand what was happening. That was when I realized I could not keep this from them much longer. But I also knew that telling them the truth was going to be one of the hardest conversations of my life. No matter what, took us all with her. All the lies she had told for a year began to surface more and more. Thinking back on that motorcycle trip where I spent a weekend with this unpleasant man made my stomach turn. Even bought that rich man a whiskey and coke. Though I despised who she was and what she had done, I was still very concerned for my mother and would listen to her sob on the phone and in front of me. She cried to my wife a lot, which I hated. This was my wife's first year in the family, and my mother was calling her bawling about how cruel my father was being to her. My mother blamed my father's twin brother for almost everything, saying he had stolen him away from her on all our guy hunting trips, and he was the reason their marriage fell apart. She was truly manic. My mother's parents and brother were disgusted with her because they loved my father so much and they refused to talk to her about it. So my wife, sisters, father, and I were the ones who got the brunt of it. She tried manipulating everyone to make them think she was the victim here, It made me sick. She tried to make it seem like she was the battered wife and my father had treated her badly. We all knew the truth, and I found myself despising her more and more as a person. My father, on the other hand, went full-blown carefree with his newly found freedom. He is a handsome man with money, and though my mother's reaction was taking a toll on him in every way, he distracted himself by getting on dating apps and seeing a number of women in their 30s and 40s, hunted every weekend, and went on motorcycle rides during the week to escape it all. My mother still does not know about the women, and honestly, after being with the same woman for 30 years, being cheated on twice, and having every aspect of his life controlled, he deserved it and needed to get it out of his system. Anyway, getting us more towards the present, my wife and I became pregnant with our first child, and the joy of it was completely overshadowed by my mother's constant meltdowns. I could not even get them in the same room to tell all my family that they were going to have a new niece or granddaughter. For 10 months, she relentlessly berated my father for not being able to forgive her, and used my unborn child, their first grandchild, as a pawn to get him back. She told him that it would be his fault if their grandchild grew up with divorced grandparents. It made my blood boil. After a while, and against me and my sister's encouragement for my father to stay strong, my father called her and slowly started to get back with her. They sold their house and now live together in a town home. My daughter is 17 months old now, and my parents have fallen back into their relationship of my mother dominating his life, despite him trying to set strong boundaries this time. It has been like when a villain gets their power back after losing them. She went from weak and broken to manipulating everyone to her will like she has always done. While all of this was happening, another problem started building in the background. My ex-wife's mother had been calling me constantly. At first, it was just a few calls asking if she could talk to the boys, but as the days passed, the calls became more frequent. She wanted to hear their voices, to check on them, to talk to them about their mom. Every time she called, I had to tell her the same thing I had not told them yet. It was not that I was trying to keep them away from her. I just knew that once the boys heard the truth, everything was going to explode emotionally. Their world was about to change forever, and I wanted to make sure I handled that moment carefully. But at the same time, the pressure was building from every direction. My ex-mother-in-law was grieving and wanted to talk to her grandsons. My oldest son was becoming more suspicious every day. And my youngest could clearly sense that something terrible was happening even if he did not know what it was. I am thankful these events and realizations did not happen sooner, otherwise I would not know that there are good women out there, and instead I would probably have a hard time trusting them. If you made it this far, thank you for reading. Man, that story is honestly wild. What makes it hit so hard is not just the cheating itself, but everything surrounding it. The lies, the manipulation, the years of trust that were slowly falling apart behind the scenes. Imagine growing up thinking one of your parents is this amazing person, someone you admire and look up to your entire life, and then slowly realizing they are not the person you thought they were. That kind of realization can really mess with your head. And the worst part is the position the son was put in. Nobody wants to be the one who discovers something like that about their own family. Finding the proof, taking the photos, and then having to call his father and break the news, that is a moment that probably sticks with someone forever. At the same time, you have to give the father some credit for the way he handled it. A lot of people in that situation would have completely lost control. But instead, he stayed calm, gathered proof, and handled it in a way that avoided turning the situation even more chaotic. But the complicated part of this whole story is what happened later. Even after everything, the relationship somehow found its way back together. And that raises a really interesting question about relationships and long-term marriages. When people have spent decades together, shared a family, built a life, sometimes the decision to stay or leave is not as simple as people on the outside might think. Still though, trust is one of those things that once broken is incredibly hard to rebuild. And for the son in this story, it sounds like the damage to his relationship with his mom might be permanent. When someone shows you who they really are, it is hard to go back to seeing them the same way you did before. But one good thing that came out of all of this is that he did not let it ruin his own view of relationships. He found someone who treats him well, someone he trusts, and someone who built a healthy life with him. And sometimes that is the best way to move forward after seeing something like this happen in your own family. But I am really curious what you guys think about this situation. Do you think the father should have stayed with her after everything that happened? Or do you think once someone cheats and lies for that long, the relationship is basically over no matter what? Let me know what you think down in the comments. All right, let us move on to the next story. My ex-wife committed suicide on Monday and I still haven't told my kids, but will on Saturday. My ex-wife and I divorced about 6 years ago and it was not a peaceful separation. The divorce was messy, emotional, and honestly pretty ugly. By the time everything was finalized, both of us were completely drained from years of arguments and resentment that had built up between us. We have two sons together who are now 9 and 13 years old, and despite everything that happened between us, we both agreed on one important thing. The kids had to come first. We ended up creating a custody arrangement that actually worked well for both of us. We live about 2 miles apart and share the kids 1 week on and 1 week off. Over time, we settled into a routine where we communicated only about the boys, things like school schedules, appointments, and pickup times. We were not friends, but we were not fighting anymore either. We were simply two parents raising the same children. After the divorce, we stopped knowing anything about each other's personal lives. I had no idea who she was dating or what she did on her weekends, and I honestly did not care to know. She seemed to feel the same way about me. For 6 years, that arrangement worked perfectly fine. Our conversations were short and practical, usually just quick texts about the kids. But about a year ago, something started to change. She became more talkative when we exchanged the boys. Normally, those handoffs were quick and simple, but suddenly she would ask questions about my work or bring up old memories from when we were still married. She also started texting me more often, sometimes just to thank me for helping with something involving the kids. None of it was inappropriate, but it definitely felt different from the way things had been for years. Then Monday happened. That afternoon, I picked the boys up from school because it was my week with them. The evening was completely normal: homework, dinner, and getting them ready for bed. Around 8 o'clock that night, I received a text from my ex. In the message, she told me that I was the only person she trusted 100% with the boys and that I was a great dad. She thanked me for everything I had done for them and then asked me to tell the boys that she loved them. The message felt strange, mostly because it was unexpected. Usually when the boys were with me, she would call my oldest son every night to say good night. But that night she did not call at all. The next morning on my way to work, I drove past her street and noticed her car was still parked outside her house. At first I assumed she might be working from home or maybe she was sick. Later that morning, I sent her a quick text asking if I could stop by later to grab my son's school book that he had accidentally left at her place. Normally, she would reply within minutes if it had something to do with the kids, but this time there was no response. An hour passed, then another, and that was when I started to feel a little uneasy. Something about the silence just did not feel right. As the morning turned into the afternoon, the silence from her side started to bother me more and more. Normally, she would respond almost immediately if I sent a message about the kids. Even if she was busy, she would at least reply within a few minutes to say she would get back to me later. But this time there was nothing. No message, no call, nothing at all. After a few hours, I decided to call her phone. It rang for a while and then went to voicemail. I left a message telling her that I needed to grab our son's school book and asked her to call me back when she had a chance. There was still nothing. At that point, I started thinking about how strange her message from the night before had been. The way she had thanked me for being a good father and told me to tell the boys she loved them suddenly felt different in my mind. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things, but the silence kept making the feeling worse. Eventually, I called her again and it went straight to voicemail. That was when I decided to leave another message. I told her that if she did not call or text me back by 2 o'clock, I was going to stop by her house just to make sure everything was okay. 2 o'clock came and went with no response. So I left work early and drove to her house. When I pulled up, the first thing I noticed was that there were several packages sitting outside her front door. That immediately felt wrong. She was the type of person who never left packages sitting outside. If something was delivered while she was not home, she would always bring it inside right away or ask a neighbor to grab it for her. Seeing them just sitting there made my stomach drop a little. I tried calling her again while standing outside the door, but once again there was no answer. I knocked a few times and waited, hoping to hear footsteps or some kind of movement inside the house, but it was completely silent. After a moment, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, calling out her name as I walked in. I expected to hear her respond from another room or maybe come downstairs asking what I was doing there. Instead, the house stayed quiet, and that uneasy feeling in my chest started getting worse. When I stepped inside the house, everything felt strangely still. The living room looked normal, nothing seemed out of place. The television was off, the couch looked untouched, and there were no signs that anyone had been moving around recently. I called her name again as I walked a little further inside, expecting at any moment to hear her answer from another room. But the house stayed completely silent. At first I told myself that maybe she had stepped out for a quick errand, but that explanation did not make sense. Her car was still parked outside and the packages were still sitting by the door. That uneasy feeling in my stomach started growing stronger. I walked slowly down the hallway, checking the kitchen and the bathroom as I passed them. Everything looked normal, but there was still no sign of her anywhere. Then I reached the bedroom. The door was slightly open, and when I pushed it the rest of the way, I immediately saw something that made my heart stop for a second. She was lying on the bed, completely still. At first, my brain tried to convince me that she was just asleep, but then I noticed the dark red stain spreading across the front of her shirt. For a moment, I just stood there frozen, trying to understand what I was seeing. In her hand, there was something that looked like a phone. My mind kept trying to make sense of the scene, but something about it did not feel right. Then it finally registered in my head that it was not a phone at all. It was a gun. That was when everything suddenly became very real. The blood on her shirt, the silence in the room, the way she was lying there without moving. My heart started racing and my hands began shaking as I backed out of the room. I pulled out my phone and called 911, trying to explain what I had just found while my mind was still struggling to process it. The next few minutes felt like a blur. I remember pacing around the living room while waiting for the police and emergency responders to arrive. I kept looking toward the hallway, almost hoping that somehow I had misunderstood what I saw. But deep down, I already knew the truth. When the police arrived, they quickly secured the house and began asking me questions. I told them everything I knew, which honestly was not much. I explained that I had not heard from her all day and came to check on her because it was unusual for her not to respond when it involved the kids. They asked about our relationship, our divorce, and the custody arrangement. Since I had been the one to find her, they needed to make sure they understood exactly what had happened. For the next 3 hours, I sat there answering questions while they documented everything inside the house. At some point, one of the officers told me that they would be contacting her parents to inform them. Because of the divorce, I was no longer considered next of kin. When they finally finished speaking with me, the reality of the situation started to sink in. I still had to go pick up my kids later that day. And somehow, I was going to have to act like everything was normal, even though I had just discovered something that was going to change their lives forever. When I finally left the house, I just sat in my car for a while trying to gather myself. Everything felt unreal. My mind kept replaying the scene over and over again, but at the same time, it felt like I was watching someone else's life instead of my own. The police had told me I was free to go, but they also asked me to stay available in case they needed to ask more questions later. As I drove away, the only thing I could think about was the boys. In a few hours, I was supposed to pick them up, and they had no idea that their entire world had just changed. By the time I arrived to get them, I had managed to calm myself down enough to keep a straight face. The kids jumped into the car like they always did, talking about school, homework, and random things that had happened during the day. I listened and nodded, trying my best to act normal while my mind was still processing everything that had happened earlier. Every time they mentioned their mom or something related to her, I felt a tight knot form in my chest. That night was one of the hardest nights I have ever experienced. I went through our usual routine with them: dinner, homework, and getting ready for bed. I kept telling myself that I needed time to figure out how to explain everything to them. My 13-year-old usually texts his mom every evening when he is with me, and on Wednesday he started getting frustrated that she was not replying. He kept checking his phone over and over again and eventually came to me asking why she was ignoring him. At first I told him that maybe her phone was off or that she might be busy with work, but he was not convinced. The more time passed, the more worried he became. Eventually he started insisting that we go to her house so he could see if she was there. That request hit me harder than anything else that day. I knew the house was still taped off by the police, and there was no way I could take him there. The next day, the situation got even harder. My oldest kept trying to text and call her, and every time there was no response, he became more upset. He told me that something was wrong and demanded that I take him to her house so he could check on her himself. He even started saying that if I did not take him, he would just go there after school on his own. Meanwhile, my 9-year-old began picking up on the tension as well. He could tell something was wrong even though he did not fully understand what was happening. That was when I realized I could not keep this from them much longer. But I also knew that telling them the truth was going to be one of the hardest conversations of my life. By Wednesday, the situation had started getting harder to manage. My 13-year-old kept checking his phone, waiting for a reply from his mom that never came. At first, he thought she might just be busy, but as the hours passed, he became more frustrated and confused. He kept asking me if I had heard from her, and every time I told him no, I could see the worry growing on his face. Eventually, he started saying that something felt wrong and that she would never ignore his messages like this. Later that day, he demanded that I take him to her house. He said if her phone was broken or if something was wrong, he wanted to be the one to help her fix it. I had to keep making excuses, telling him that she was probably working or that she might have left her phone somewhere. But he was not buying it. He kept insisting that we go over there just to check. At one point, he even said that if I would not take him, he would just go there himself after school. Meanwhile, my 9-year-old started noticing the tension too. Kids can pick up on things even when you think you are hiding them well. He could tell that something was off between me and his older brother. When I tried dropping him off at school the next morning, he refused to get out of the car. He started crying and asking why his mom had not called them in 2 days. Eventually, he had a complete meltdown in the parking lot, and I had to calm him down before I could convince him to go inside. That was when I realized I could not keep pretending that everything was normal. The boys were starting to sense that something serious had happened, and the longer I waited, the worse their imaginations would become. At the same time, I knew I was not emotionally prepared to tell them the truth yet. I had barely processed it myself. I decided to speak with my oldest son's school principal privately. I explained that my son would probably need to miss some school the following week. At first, the principal looked confused and asked what could possibly be so important that he needed to miss an entire week of school. After a moment of silence, I told him the truth. I said that their mother had taken her own life a few days earlier, and that I had not yet told the boys. The principal's expression immediately changed. He understood the seriousness of the situation and told me that the school would support my kids in any way they could once they knew what had happened. Walking out of that office, the reality of the situation felt heavier than ever. I knew that sooner or later I was going to have to sit my sons down and tell them something that no child should ever have to hear. While all of this was happening, another problem started building in the background. My ex-wife's mother had been calling me constantly. At first, it was just a few calls asking if she could talk to the boys, but as the days passed, the calls became more frequent. She wanted to hear their voices, to check on them, to talk to them about their mom. Every time she called, I had to tell her the same thing I had not told them yet. It was not that I was trying to keep them away from her. I just knew that once the boys heard the truth, everything was going to explode emotionally. Their world was about to change forever, and I wanted to make sure I handled that moment carefully. But at the same time, the pressure was building from every direction. My ex-mother-in-law was grieving and wanted to talk to her grandsons. My oldest son was becoming more suspicious every day. And my youngest could clearly sense that something terrible was happening even if he did not know what it was. By Friday night, the tension in the house was almost unbearable. My 13-year-old kept asking questions. He kept saying that his mom would never go this long without replying to him. He started throwing out different possibilities, trying to make sense of it. Maybe she lost her phone, maybe she was sick, maybe she went somewhere and forgot to tell anyone. Every explanation he came up with only made him more frustrated. At one point, he looked straight at me and said, "Dad, you know something, don't you?" That question hit me harder than anything else had that week. I realized I could not keep delaying it. The longer I waited, the more confused and anxious they were becoming. I spent most of Friday night lying awake, thinking about how I was going to tell them. There is no guidebook for a moment like that. No parent is ever prepared to explain something like this to their children. Eventually, I decided that Saturday would be the day. I planned to sit both of them down together and explain what had happened as gently as I could. I knew my 13-year-old was going to take it especially hard. He is old enough to understand the finality of death, but still young enough that something like this could shake him deeply. I kept imagining how he might react: anger, confusion, disbelief, maybe all of it at once. But avoiding the conversation was no longer an option. Sooner or later, they were going to learn the truth, and it had to come from me. That was my responsibility as their father. Even though I felt completely unprepared for the storm that was coming, I knew there was no way around it. Saturday morning was approaching, and I could already feel the weight of that moment hanging over the entire house. Saturday morning came faster than I expected. I barely slept the night before. My mind kept going through different ways I could start the conversation, but none of them felt right. How do you even begin to explain something like that to your children? There is no good way to say it. There is no version of those words that does not change everything. The boys woke up like it was any other Saturday. My youngest went straight to the kitchen asking what we were having for breakfast, while my oldest grabbed his phone again to check if his mom had finally replied to his messages. Watching him stare at that screen knowing there would never be a reply again was one of the hardest things I have ever experienced. After breakfast, I told them we needed to sit down and talk for a minute. They could tell from the tone in my voice that something serious was coming. My 13-year-old immediately asked if this was about their mom. I told them both to come sit with me in the living room. For a moment, I just sat there looking at them, trying to find the right words. Then I told them that something very sad had happened earlier in the week. I explained that their mom had passed away. At first, there was silence. My youngest looked confused more than anything. He asked what I meant and whether she was sick. My 13-year-old, on the other hand, seemed to understand immediately that something much bigger had happened. He kept staring at me like he was waiting for me to say it was some kind of mistake. When it finally started sinking in, the reaction was exactly what I feared. My youngest began crying almost immediately, asking why he could not talk to her anymore. My oldest got angry. He started pacing around the room, asking 100 questions at once. He wanted to know when it happened, why nobody told him sooner, and why she had not said goodbye. I tried to answer as calmly and honestly as I could without overwhelming them with details they were too young to process. Mostly, I just stayed with them while they cried and asked questions. That entire day felt like an emotional storm moving through the house. Over the next few days, things slowly began to settle. Not in the sense that anyone felt better, but in the sense that reality started setting in. Their grandmother eventually spoke with them, and the school arranged for counselors to help them when they were ready to return. It became clear that healing from something like this was going to take a long time. As for me, I still think about that night she texted me, the message about trusting me with the boys and telling them she loved them. At the time it seemed strange, but looking back now it feels like it was her way of saying goodbye. Now my focus is completely on my sons. They have already been through more than most kids their age should ever have to experience. My job now is simply to be there for them, to help them grow up, and to make sure they know that even in the middle of something this painful, they are not alone. Some days are harder than others, but we are taking it one day at a time. And right now, that is the best any of us can do. And that brings us to the end of this story. It is honestly one of those situations where there are no perfect explanations and no easy answers. A family that had already gone through a difficult divorce suddenly faced an even bigger tragedy. And in the middle of all of it was a father who had to carry an unimaginable responsibility. Not only did he discover what had happened, but he also had to find the strength to sit down with his children and tell them something no parent ever wants to say. Moments like that change a family forever. What makes this story especially heartbreaking is how normal everything seemed at first. Just a regular routine, picking the kids up from school, helping with homework, making dinner, and getting ready for another ordinary week. But in a matter of hours, everything shifted. One message, one unanswered call, and suddenly an entire life was turned upside down. It is also a reminder that people can be going through battles we never fully see. From the outside, someone might appear to be managing their life just fine. They might be going to work, taking care of responsibilities, and interacting with people like everything is normal. But internally, they could be dealing with struggles that are much heavier than anyone around them realizes. That does not make what happened any less painful for the people left behind. In fact, it often leaves even more questions for the family, questions that may never have clear answers. In this case, the two people most affected are the children. Losing a parent at such a young age is something that stays with someone for the rest of their life. But at the same time, they still have a father who clearly cares deeply about them and is doing everything he can to support them through something incredibly difficult. Sometimes in situations like this, the best anyone can do is take things one day at a time. Healing does not happen quickly, and grief is not something that disappears overnight. It takes time, patience, and a lot of support from the people around you. Stories like this are hard to listen to, but they also remind us how important it is to pay attention to the people in our lives. Checking in on someone, listening when they need to talk, and taking mental health seriously can make a bigger difference than we often realize. Hopefully, with time, support, and love from the people around them, this family will slowly find a way to move forward. And with that being said, let us move on to the next story. I am responsible for the deaths of several people. Around 4 years ago, I was a vendor on the darknet. It was not something I did for very long, but during that time it completely changed my life. Back then I was young, lazy, and honestly did not want to work a regular job. The idea of waking up every day and working a 9 to 5 felt unbearable to me. I kept telling myself that I wanted to start my own business someday, but I needed money to get started. In my mind, the plan was simple. make some fast money dealing drugs, and eventually use that money to start a legitimate business. I had already been around drugs for years. I used occasionally, and through that lifestyle, I met a lot of people who were involved in dealing. Eventually, I started selling small amounts myself. The problem was that I had terrible anxiety. Meeting people in parking lots, waiting for them to show up, and constantly worrying about being watched made me extremely uncomfortable. I also hated the idea of anyone knowing where I lived. That was when I first started reading about the darknet. I remember reading about the Silk Road and the arrest of Ross Ulbricht. Instead of scaring me away from the idea, it fascinated me. I became obsessed with learning how those markets worked. I spent hours reading about encryption, anonymity, and operational security. I convinced myself that if I learned enough and stayed careful, I could run a small store without anyone ever knowing who I was. After a couple of months of preparing and learning everything I could, I finally opened my own darknet store. At the beginning, I only sold three things: ketamine, meth, and some outdoor weed that a friend of mine was getting for extremely cheap. Surprisingly, everything started going well. Orders were coming in regularly, and I was building a small reputation on the market. At one point, a market exit scam stole a couple $1,000s from me, but I had already saved about $25,000 by then. Losing that money did not ruin me like it did for some other vendors. From the outside, everything seemed like it was working perfectly. Eventually, I met a new supplier who would end up changing everything. He was a local contact who came into town about once a week, but when he showed up, he had almost anything someone could ask for. Mescaline, LSD, mushrooms, PCP, things I had never even considered selling before. Having access to that many different substances made my store much more appealing to buyers. One day he mentioned something else he could get: fentanyl. At that time, fentanyl was not nearly as common as it is now. Today it is known for being mixed into other drugs and causing countless overdoses, but back then people usually bought fentanyl intentionally. It was not something people talked about with the same fear that surrounds it today. Around that same time, I had started selling a batch of very pure powdered mescaline. It was extremely white and had a fine powder consistency. The fentanyl my supplier had also looked very similar, another very fine white powder. I kept careful records of every order using an Excel spreadsheet. I tracked customers' names, addresses, zip codes, the products they ordered, and the amounts. Everything was organized so I could package orders quickly and ship them out. But one mistake in that system ended up destroying several lives. To this day, I still do not fully understand how it happened. Either my spreadsheet glitched or I made a mistake while organizing the orders. But somehow, 7 mescaline orders were accidentally marked as fentanyl orders. I packaged everything like I normally did and shipped the orders out without noticing anything was wrong. For the next few days, I continued working as usual, filling orders and preparing packages. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. About 5 days later, I received a message from someone on the market. They told me their friend had died after using the mescaline I sold them. My first reaction was disbelief. I assumed they were lying or trying to scam me. Mescaline does not cause overdoses like that. It did not make any sense. But something about the message bothered me enough that I decided to double-check my inventory. I weighed the mescaline I still had left and compared it with my records. That was when I noticed something terrifying. I had about 11 grams more mescaline than I should have had. My heart dropped immediately. I went back to my order logs and started reviewing every transaction. Then I noticed something else strange. None of the customers who had ordered mescaline on a certain day had finalized their purchases. The marketplace also showed the last time users had logged in. None of them had been active in days. That was the moment I realized what had happened. I did not need anyone to confirm it for me. I already knew. Those customers had not received mescaline. They had received fentanyl. I had accidentally sent one of the most dangerous substances in the world to people who believed they were taking something completely different. I immediately shut down my vendor account. I sold the rest of my drugs, converted my Bitcoin into cash, and left that entire life behind. Within days, I moved away to another city where no one knew me. I cut off contact with almost everyone I used to know and started working a normal job at a restaurant. I have not touched drugs since that day. I have not been involved in that world at all. But I still think about it constantly. A few days after everything happened, I searched the names of the customers online. I was able to confirm that at least 4 of them had died. One of those customers had shared the drugs with a friend. Both of them died. 6 people. Every night I think about them. I live a quiet life now. I wake up, go to work, come home, and spend most of my time alone. I barely talk to anyone anymore. People I used to know say I am not the same person I used to be, and they are right. I feel like a shell of who I was before. I do not even know why I am sharing this. I have never told anyone. I cannot even imagine saying this out loud to a therapist. Most days I feel like I do not deserve to be alive. I just exist, going through the motions, wondering if anything could ever make this weight go away. And that is where we are going to end today's final story. Honestly, this one is difficult to sit with, not because it is dramatic or shocking in the usual way, but because it forces you to think about consequences in a way that most of us never have to. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, one decision that seemed small at the time, and suddenly several lives are gone forever. When people think about the darknet or the drug trade, they often imagine it as something distant or abstract. It becomes numbers, transactions, anonymous usernames, packages moving through the mail. It can almost feel like a game to the people involved. But stories like this remind us that behind every transaction there are real human beings on the other side. Real people with families, friends, and lives. And when something goes wrong, those consequences do not stay online. They do not disappear into some anonymous system. They ripple outward into the real world in ways that cannot be undone. In this story, the person telling it was not someone who set out with the intention of hurting anyone. In fact, like many people who get involved in that world, he convinced himself that what he was doing was just temporary. Just a way to make money quickly, just a step towards something else. But reality does not always care about intentions. Sometimes a single mistake can carry consequences that last a lifetime. And that is really what makes this story so haunting. It is not just about the people who died. It is also about the weight that the person telling the story now carries every single day. The guilt, the regret, the constant reminders that those lives were lost because of something he did. Whether it was an accident or not, the outcome is something that cannot be erased. It also raises difficult questions about responsibility, forgiveness, and whether someone can ever truly move forward after something like that. Some people would say that he deserves to live with that guilt forever. Others might argue that people are capable of changing and learning from their mistakes, but there is no simple answer. What is clear, though, is that choices matter. Even the ones that feel small or temporary at the time can end up shaping entire lives in ways we never expected. Another thing that stands out in this story is the way guilt can isolate someone. The person telling this confession described becoming a shell of who he used to be. Working, going home, staying alone, avoiding people, and carrying something he feels like he can never talk about. And that kind of isolation is something a lot of people can relate to in different ways. When someone carries something heavy enough, whether it is guilt, regret, or trauma, it can slowly pull them away from the world around them. But the truth is that humans are not meant to carry everything alone. Even the darkest confessions, the ones people feel too ashamed to say out loud, still reflect something deeply human: the need to be heard. The need to say, "This happened and I do not know what to do with it." And maybe that is part of why stories like this exist, not to glorify mistakes, not to excuse harmful actions, but to remind us that behind every headline, every statistic, every tragedy, there are complicated human stories that do not always fit into simple categories of good and bad. Sometimes people make terrible decisions. Sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes consequences are far bigger than the person responsible ever imagined. And once those consequences exist, the only thing left is figuring out how to live with them. For the person who wrote this confession, it sounds like the rest of his life will be shaped by that moment. The memory of those people, the knowledge of what happened, and the constant question of whether he deserves to move forward at all. And that is something we can all think about, not just in extreme situations like this, but in our own lives, the way our choices affect others, the way responsibility works. The way regret can follow us if we are not careful about the paths we take. Stories like this are uncomfortable, they are heavy, but sometimes the uncomfortable ones are the ones that stay with us the longest. Because they force us to reflect on things we might otherwise ignore. And that brings us to the end of today's video. If you made it all the way through these stories, thank you for listening. Some of these confessions are disturbing, some are emotional, and some leave us with more questions than answers. But that is what makes them powerful. If you have thoughts about this last story, feel free to share them in the comments. I read through a lot of them, and it is always interesting to see how different people interpret situations like this. And if you have your own confession or story that you want to share, you can send it to the email in the description below. With that being said, take care of yourselves, look out for the people around you, and I will see you in the next video.